Have you ever felt like your classroom is chaotic? Are students not listening? They won't follow directions? Well, I am here to tell you I have been there, my friends. And not every classroom is perfect. Students don't sit at their seats ready and focused and paying attention all day long. That's just not real life. It's a common challenge, but I have some solutions and suggestions for you to help make that difference in your teacher life. I'm April, creator of Teach, Travel, Read, and I have been teaching in the classroom for 15 years. If you are ready to turn things around as a veteran teacher, or maybe you're a new teacher and you need some advice and suggestions from somebody who's actually in the thick of it, grab your favorite beverage, sit back, maybe even grab a notebook and something to write with, and let's get started. So this is the second video in my classroom management series. I'm going to be talking all about how to set those clear expectations, rules, and procedures within your classroom. We want to make sure that students are following those rules and expectations in the way that they're set from the beginning of day one. It starts from that first moment when they walk in the door. There's a very famous book that was written a long time ago. It's been a while, but everything that's in there still is true. It's called The First Days of School, and it's by Harry Long, and it really has held up as a testament over time. Now, have we had to adjust things differently over the past few decades in terms of some of our classroom management and things? Yes. But one of my favorite things from that book in my college student teaching days was that you have to start from the first moment of day one in setting up those routines and expectations with your students. If they do not follow that, then they're not going to follow it the rest of the year. So we want to think about first steps here is you want to start the year with some very concise, clear rules and or expectations for your students. Some people like to use the word expectations. Some people like to use rules, maybe a mixture of both. It just kind of depends on the person, but they're basically the guidelines that the students are expected to follow. So you want to have your rules very straightforward and easy to remember. So for example, a lot of times schools will have a pledge that the students recite in at least elementary schools. Things like, I will keep hands, feet, and other objects to myself. There's no misinterpretation there. Hands, feet, other objects, all stay to myself. Thinking about things like that keeps it clear and consistent. Thinking of things like being respectful, okay? Yes, you're going to deep dive into how do we show that respect for our classmates, for the adults in the building, but being respectful is a rule. There's no negotiating on that. It may be things like you require them to raise their hand to speak. Depending on your classroom and what you're doing, there may be times maybe where you don't want them to raise their hand, but that could be one. One of my favorites is something called whole body listening. So your eyes are on the speaker, your hands are still, your feet are still, you're sitting nice, and you track the person. So anywhere they're walking around the room speaking, you do that. If it's a classmate, same thing. You are looking at that person. We're not twiddling with our fingers. We're not twirling our pencil. We're not drawing. That is not whole body listening. We need to be actively listening so we can repeat what people are saying. And some people can listen without actually having to look. But again, it goes back to that term of respect. When you keep those rules simple, they're easier for the students to understand and follow. You want to aim for maybe about 3 to 5 rules for the students, so it doesn't feel too overwhelming. Like I think about this scene in Harry Potter where it had all these proclamations of this, and it was just the whole wall full. That just becomes too much. and leads to rebellion. So we want to think about 3 to 5. Maybe your school has already established those rules set in place for the classroom. Maybe, like for my school, for example, we have some specific rules we follow in the classroom. We have specific rules that we follow in the hallways. We have specific things for the playground, for the cafeteria, for the buses. So every area has those specific rules and expectations that people need to follow. So we want to think about what specifically do we want our students to follow. So maybe pause this video, take a minute and just brain dump all of the ideas of things you would want to make sure your students are following within the classroom. What do you picture in your mind as that perfect classroom? And then narrow it down. Can they be divided into some specific categories? These are classroom rules, these are hallways rules, these are restroom rules, etc. What do you want to really focus on with your students? I'll still be here when you come back. Now that you've done that, I want you to think about your classroom, and in the comments below, drop down what are those rules or expectations you want your students to make sure they are following. Let's share these ideas together. What works so well for your students in your classroom? Help each other out. The more we share, the more we learn, we can collaborate and make a better, thriving education world. Okay, so in terms of talking about rules and making sure that expectations are followed, making sure that they're clear, concise, easy for students to understand, my school actually has this already created for everybody. We have them for our classroom, we have them for the hallways, for the restrooms, cafeteria, bus, recess, playground, all of the spaces we have these for. So it's very, very much basic level rules and expectations. We go over them at the beginning of the year. We continuously revisit them throughout the year, but they are posted in the classroom all the time so that we can continuously go back and look at those as needed to making sure that we're following those rules and expectations. When it comes to establishing those rules and expectations, we can't just post them up on the wall and be like, okay, well, the students can read them, or I discussed them randomly one time the first week of school. Now we're good. Nope. They're children, just like adults need reminders about a lot of things. Kids need those constant reminders as well. And so this part is key, that we are communicating constantly about those expectations. It may feel sometimes like you are nagging and you may feel frustrated, but the more you say it, the better it's going to be for them to follow along with it. So start that first day of school by explaining each of those rules and why it's important. The older your students are, the more of a discussion you can have about it. Have them think about, how do you feel when a classroom people are constantly shouting and making noise? Your students who can't handle that type of environment are going to say, well, it's really distracting for me, or it makes me very anxious at times. Okay, but even emphasizing there's a time and a place for some of that discussion. When should we be talking to the people around us? When should we be sharing out ideas in an appropriate manner? Okay, so we may not always be raising our hand to speak depending on what we are doing. If we're working together in a small group, we're not always going to be raising our hands. That's just not realistic to our world. So providing those examples, maybe even role playing, having the students act it out to show what does that appropriately look like. The more time you spend on this the first week of school, even maybe the first day of school, but we know the first few weeks of school we're really practicing those routines and procedures, the better off the rest of your school year is going to be. Again, it's not going to be perfect. That doesn't exist in the world. but thinking about how can we set this up from the very beginning to help our students throughout the rest of the school year. Constantly go back and review those rules and expectations, maybe setting those as class goals to continue working on or improving. If they're really struggling with that, the more you talk about it, the more you practice, the better they will become. I would like to know, what are some creative ways that you've used to communicate rules to your students? Always looking for fresh new ideas, so share out in the comments below, what do you do? I would like to know, and I bet other teachers would too. Now here's a tip that can make a big difference, is having your students help create those classroom rules. Now when I say that, most of the time they're still going to come up with what you expect them to do. They may even come up with some things that maybe you didn't think about was necessary as a rule, that you just kind of thought, they should know this. But sometimes when they help create those rules, they're going to be more likely to follow it. So having that open discussion about, here's what this means, why is it important, how can we write that as a rule, making them pledge that they're going to follow that. Again, you could have them sign it even. Do a thumbprint, something that shows I am part of this and I'm going to follow those rules and expectations. When they feel like they have a sense of ownership, then they're going to be more likely to follow and be responsible for what they helped create. So I'm curious if you've ever had students help you create your classroom rules. If so, how did that go? What kinds of ideas did they come up with? Again, probably depending on the age, that's going to make a difference, but more than likely they're going to come up with some of the same things that we would come up with as well. Especially if they've been in school for several years, they know how school works. So when it comes to creating the positive classroom environment, making those rules and expectations, here's the book, We the Kids, and it's by David Catrow, if I'm saying that correctly. It's the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, and so it actually goes through, it has the words, it has illustrations that go with each part of the preamble. But the great thing about this is when it was written, there's a part in the book, depending on my class, sometimes we use the pictures, sometimes I show them this, which actually tells them what does that mean, because it's written from the 1700s. We don't speak in those vocabulary terms, so we talk about what does that actually mean. So for example, the word preamble, there's a great way to say pre means before. So the first part of something, an introduction. So this is the introduction to the Constitution. And then we break it down. So we, the people of the United States, all people in our country, including kids. So then when we write our class constitution, a lot of times they'll say, we, the students in Miss Pickett's class, or we, the students in room 24, or we, the students that blah, blah, blah. Like, thinking about how can you tweak it for your class to make it beneficial for them. Okay, last, definitely not least, is consistency. Consistency is imperative. You have to enforce those rules and expectations or they're not going to be followed. We as human people tend to want to break or gravitate away from that, maybe bend it a little bit, test the waters. That's just who we are as people. So when we think about that, we want to think about what can we do to be consistent when we follow those rules and expectations. So if it's something with a consequence, you want to be fair. What consequence goes with what rule that was broken? You want to be consistent about it. What consequence you give to one student, you need to give that same consequence to that other student that does the same thing. If a rule's broken, address it immediately, but it doesn't always necessarily need to be called out in front of everyone. Sometimes just walking over and whispering to them in a lower voice makes everybody feel a little uncomfortable and kind of gets the point across. Yelling across the classroom doesn't necessarily have that same effect. Thinking about how can we maintain this environment, we want to make sure that we're following those rules appropriately. There are times where if the students don't follow that expectation, I make them start over and try again. That's part of setting up the expectations from the very beginning of the school year and part of maintaining it throughout the school year. So for example, when I call them to line up, if we're transitioning to go somewhere, if they don't do it appropriately the first time, I say, sit back down and we're going to try again. They try again. If they do better, I give them praise. I say, much better job. Nice job on that. So-and-so is doing fantastic in the line. Again, looking at those positive aspects of it, but still being consistent and firm and following those rules and expectations. There you have it. Part 2 of the classroom management series, all about rules and expectations within the classroom. Just as a quick recap, we want to make sure thinking about how we are going to develop those rules and expectations, how are we going to communicate them, how are we involving the students in there, how are we being consistent, and how are we going to set up our classroom for success. If you found these tips helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that notification bell to be updated on future. This series will continue. I have a few more videos I'm going to be sharing, so stay tuned. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the comments below. We can share and learn it together. Also, check out the links in the description below for some free printables that you can use to help you set up your classroom in terms of those rules and expectations. I have a back to school planning guide as well as a classroom management planning guide that you can download for free. Thank you for watching. Until next time.